We are live. I am delighted. This is the DCM after party for our pre-Shavuot Tikkun Leil. Of course, we're all going to be doing this tomorrow night in our own homes. But today or tonight, we've got a truly amazing speaker, an international speaker, all the way from Bourwood, then to Israel, then to New York. It is Rabbi Joe Wolfson, who grew up down the road from me. It's always good to listen to. Joe, we are delighted that you are here. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Greetings, Boreham Wood. I'm very, very upset that the chat and the schmooze ended as I came in. The main point of Tikkun Leil is all of the time spent not learning, talking in between with people, and I'm really worried and concerned that in this move to online Tikkun Leils, there is far too much learning scheduled. I haven't seen anybody advertising. Okay, Samuel, I see that. That is good, but I haven't really seen anybody advertising. You know, the wasting time room. Like, you know, there needs to be like an hour scheduled in order to like decide which one you're going to go to, and then you don't actually go to it. I don't know if anyone's ever been in Jerusalem for Shavuot, where it's beautiful. Like all these shuls have got Tikkun Leils, and no one's in the shuls. They're always like in the streets deciding which shul to go to. So, you know, far more problematic than Seder night over Zoom, I think, is this pre-Shavuot Tikkun Leil over Zoom. I'm going to do, I see Yaakov has left his seat, so I don't know if he can still do this. I actually would love for people to be, firstly, thank you so much that so many of you have got your cameras on. That helps massively. If you are quiet, if there's not lots of noise in your background, please do unmute yourselves. I don't think we're like hundreds of people on this. In my experience of teaching on Zoom so far, it's only bearable if this is something which can like be interactive and have people also talking with one another. So Yaakov, is that possible to arrange? Would you be able to unmute people and they can unmute themselves if
I'm going to mute everybody and then mute yourself if you want to be muted.
Okay, great. Is there a parallel Boreham Wood Tikkun going on now in addition to this? Someone just messaged me saying that there's a woman speaking. I might have a feminine voice, but I don't think that's what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think Shelby Friedman's speaking on a, I think there's an Aish one at the moment as well, perhaps.
You're actually part of the counter event. You didn't know, but you're part of the counter event.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
I had no idea there was another talk going on at the time. I do apologise if that is the case. I wasn't aware.
Oh, I'm not offended at all. I just think they might on the link. Anyway, so Yaakov abandoned Stratfield Road to first move to Elstree and then move to the south side. I went to Manhattan. There's really no difference between the two whatsoever. It's exactly the same, and it's great to be with you all. I see Carol here on this call. Hi, Carol. So there are some of you who have been around long enough to remember when I was a kid growing up in Boreham Wood, and Boreham Wood is very, very close to my heart, and so lovely to be learning with all of you. I'm actually going to.
You're on Young Professionals. You're not like anyone today. Did you do
I'm actually going to change my my topic, if that's all right. I decided
That's absolutely fine.
to be adventurous and share a different. Thank you. Could you enable screen share for me? Right now, I'm not able to.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, but don't worry, I'll introduce it whilst we are doing. Okay, so here's what we're going to do, folks. I want to learn with you all tonight a piece from a work called Pachad Yitzchak. Pachad Yitzchak is the work of a man called Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, who is I'd argue, one of the great Jewish thinkers and theologians of the 20th century. He's someone who I've only really come to know in the last few years, maybe 5-6 years or so. It's something that I find to be very inspiring, I guess, that one can, be involved in Jewish education for a long time, been doing Jewish studies since a young age, and to discover something new at a later stage in one's development. And it's certainly been a blessing for me to be able to, even after many years of study, to come across both not just new works, but also like new ways of thinking, new ways of expressing oneself religiously. And I think that's a beautiful thing about loving Jewish learning and Talmud Torah. So Rav Hutner had a fascinating life story. I'll give just a very sort of brief intro to it. There's much more to say. He was born in Europe in the early 20th century. He grew up in that Eastern European world. He moved to Israel. He was studying in the Great Yeshiva in Hebron in the 1920s. He left one weekend for Shabbat to visit family or friends, and that was the weekend of the Hebron massacre in 1929. He was a student of Rav Kook in Israel. He returned to Europe and spent the early 30s in Berlin, where sort of all of the greats of the Jewish 20th century were concentrated. Then he moved to America, and where he sort of spent the core decades of his life and became a very sort of significant figure in the Jewish American scene. And he was really someone who lived and saw the 20th century. He writes in a very unique style. It can be quite challenging, but also very beautiful. It's sort of rabbinic Hebrew becomes poetry. And it's often quite dark. A lot of his pieces, the piece that we're going to look at today, is not dark at all, but he does have that. It's sort of quite muscular and emotional, and it's something which I'm excited to share with you all. It's a short piece. I need to apologize if you all drop off the call straight after this. I will forgive you. I have not been able to translate it, but I will translate it for everybody. I promise. And please do be interactive with it. It's just 4 short paragraphs, and let's have some fun with it. Okay. Please, if there's something I say which isn't clear, please ask me. If there's something you want to say, please volunteer it. So I'm going to start reading. Okay. Begins as follows: Ki kai Rabbi Bahai Masechta. Rabbi was the great author of the Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. When he would be learning a Masechet, one of the portions of the Talmud.
Sorry, Rabs, it might just be me, but I'm not able to see the text at the moment. Is anybody else having that difficulty?
I'm also not able to see it.
I can't see this.
I'm seeing your folder, but not. I'm seeing your folder with the thumbnail, but not the document.
So do you know what happened? I purposefully didn't share it in order to see whether actually anybody would say anything, or.
Well,
I was also wondering if I was earlier when you mentioned it would be the Pachad Yitzhak trying to find this on Safaria, but I didn't have any luck. But if anyone else knows that this is on Safaria, then that might be useful as well.
Probably not. Are you seeing it now?
yes, thank you.
It's there on the screen now.
Okay, great, good. Aaron is listening, and people are unmuted, and this is excellent. Okay. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would be learning one portion of the Torah, one Masechet, and he would say to anybody who would approach him, he said, when I'm learning this Masechet, he'd say, Al tishali b'masechta acharita. Don't ask me about any other Masechet, any other area. If I'm learning about Shabbat, don't ask me about Kashrut. If I'm learning Bava Kama, don't ask me Sanhedrin. If I'm learning Bereshit, don't ask me Vayikra. That's the phrase. Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. So it says Rav Hutner. Says Lichora, it would seem that miniyat ha'she'ela, this telling someone not to ask a question, b'masechta acharita, in a different area, mista'efet hi mechashash chulshato v'kotzer yado shel hanishal. It comes from a place of weakness or of inability on the part of the person being asked. Right? If I say to you, oh, you can ask me about this, you can't ask me about that, that's presumably because I don't know about something else. Right? That's what it seems to imply. But as the Rishonim, the great rabbis of the Middle Ages explained it, actually lehefech, it's the opposite. If I say to somebody, or someone says, don't ask me about another area, actually, that actually expresses the greatness of the person who is being asked. Isn't that lovely? Now, this is what we're going to dive into. Anyone want to try and unpack that for themselves? The simple reading of that phrase, as Raputna says, is that you can ask me about this, you can't ask me about that. Presumably says that my expertise is not all that great. But apparently it's the opposite. The fact that you can't ask me about a certain area when I'm learning something else actually shows how great the teacher is. Why would that be?
Well, I think to the extent that you're engaging in multiple things, it limits how deep you can get onto one particular thing and how immersed you can get. And it's also interesting because, in terms of what's in vogue in yeshivot, and in general, there's obviously very much a pressure to cover a very large amount of ground. I know Aaron Carr here, for example, is an adherent to Daf Yomi, and there's obviously, there's the urge to learn more, but there's also the sense that if you do that, you almost can't be at one with a particular question or a particular idea.
I'd just like to point out that Adam Hill's math is also following Daf Yomi. And also, if you learn yesterday's Daf, then you definitely would want to learn more because it was incredibly exciting.
Well, I would like to point out that it wasn't until I heard his voice that I realized who Naftali R is on this.
It must be my beard. It must be my long beard, Joe.
Yes, this beard which has appeared in the last time since I saw Naftali somewhere in Yehuda V'Shomron is correct. Wow, did not know you were a Bournemouth resident now.
I'm here to support Aaron. I live in Edgware.
Wow, controversial.
He's a young person resident, so he sort of qualifies.
I see. Well, perhaps the beauty of this Tikkun Leil will convince you to move to Bournemouth. Thank you. Anyone else want to suggest a reading of this as to why not being asked about a certain, if I say you can't ask me about that, why that isn't an expression of weakness, but an expression of strength?
I guess if you want to really delve into something, you don't want to have any distractions of other areas, and you want to sort of devote yourself entirely to that one specific question, and sort of you don't want to be distracted.
I don't mind your beard, Naftali. I was enjoying looking at it. So Samuel, I am listening. I just want.
Yeah, I think you don't want to be distracted by other issues, and you want to sort of focus entirely on that one question, because there are so many questions in the Torah. So I guess we have to focus somewhere, have some sort of focus for a bit of time.
Well, Samuel, that word distraction is, I think, such an interesting one, and one that's really worth bearing in mind as we look at this piece. So let's see what Raputna says. He says, Mishum, v'hainu mishum, this is because, this is the fifth line down, halfway through. The dafka gadluto shel adam, the greatness of a person, hi machayevet hishtakut gemura, is what obligates their complete commitment, umuchleta, their absolute commitment, b'masechta shuhu omed ba, to the area which they are learning right now. Ad kadei, to such an extent, shlilat ha'efsharut ha'tshuva b'masechta achrita, that it becomes impossible for them to think or talk about anything else. It is such a beautiful idea that you are so committed to something that you can't really think of anything else. You are so involved in something, you can't split your attention and your thoughts and your mind between. V'adarab, on the contrary, ad kama shetachaser midat gadlo shel harav, the opposite, to the extent that a person is not actually such a great teacher, ken la'umat zeh, exactly corresponding with that, yiktan chomer ha'azhara shel ha'she'ela b'masechta acharita, the easier it will be for them to answer a question in a different area. And I think just a simple way to make this clear for everybody what this is talking about is just to consider our contemporary lives. I mean, if your life is anything like mine, which I imagine it is, I have 5,000 things on the go, right? If I was to screen share my Chrome right now, you would see an embarrassingly large number of tabs open. There are WhatsApp messages that I have not responded to. There is this one thing I'm thinking about. There's my kids who I know I'm being a terrible father to over here. I've got to get this report done. I'm thinking about so many things. I'm quote unquote answering so many things. I am really not in one place, right? The opposite of that, which is what's being spoken about here, is to be so immersed in something that actually there's no sort of like space within you for thinking about something else. Okay, any sort of thoughts or responses at this moment?
If there are kind of deepest answers to these questions are revealed by people who have not just a good sense, but a working knowledge of all areas of Torah in order to link things together. How does that relate to the idea of simply focusing on what's in front of you at any one time?
Daniel, I didn't actually hear the first few words of what you were saying. Was it that?
If some of the deepest and greatest answers to some of the questions that were presented in the text come from the idea of relating ideas from across the Torah, how can you possibly gain that level of knowledge by simply focusing on what's in front of you?
That's really interesting. I'm not sure that as we move through the piece that it's going to look like he's necessarily advocating only ever focusing on one thing. I'm not sure that's what I think it might be subtly different to that. But I think he's going to partly answer that, or at least he's going to draw out attention. Meaning, if we were to think of a phrase in the English language, which is sort of like comes close to this, I think it would be, the jack of all trades is the master of none, right? That's what it's sounding like. And of course, you're right to say, Daniel, but nevertheless, there's some magic which occurs when you combine different things, right? When you sort of one area allows. So keep the thought in mind.
Aaron mentioned yesterday when we were talking, he's a teacher as well. And there's a concept in pedagogy. I don't know if I pronounced that word correct. Pedagogy.
Are you going to talk about felt difficulty?
Exactly. We were talking about
thinking of this as well.
We were talking about felt difficulty in that you can only really answer a question once you, and you can only deal seriously with a question once it's a felt difficulty to you. And to the extent that you can, I guess, recite knowledge or just internalize information, that's somewhat superficial until you make something your whole concern and sort of a felt difficulty.
I've never heard that phrase before, but I like it quite a lot.
It's from John Dewey. So it's from the educational theorist and philosopher John Dewey, and he discusses the idea of that you have to access a level of discomfort, that a question has to sit with you before learning can take place, because if you don't go through sort of that psychological journey from discomfort to resolution, if there's no kind of moment where tension is resolved, then you haven't transformed your understanding in any way. You've simply remembered something. So he has kind of more existential definition of what learning is, where he thinks it's about transforming knowledge through resolving tension, and that leads to sort of an educational style where you explore lines of inquiry. And I think that lends itself very well to what this text is suggesting, that if you're exploring a certain line of inquiry, you have to be invested fully in that journey. And and it doesn't mean you can't ask slightly tangential questions, but if you bring in a separate question that is not about your focus, then it's clear you're not really invested in the question.
That's beautifully put. I'm mark that phrase down. Felt difficulty. Good.
Sam has put a Wikipedia link in the chat to John Dewey if anyone wants to look it up.
Which Aaron probably wrote.
John Dewey is one of those people who I always hear quoted in things, but I've never actually. He's never actually, fully taken up my own thing. But that's awesome. Okay, so there are four paragraphs here. We've done the first one. Something you always have to sort of think about with Rav Hutner is you can be reading it and understanding it, and then you pause and you think, wait a second, what on earth has this got to do with the previous thing that I was reading? So there are only going to be 4 paragraphs. The second paragraph I'll just sort of say over quickly. He shares an idea, which is that the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai, what we're commemorating on Shavuot, all the details of it should not be thought of as a one-time event, but rather all of the different aspects and ingredients of that original Nitinat Torah, revelation of the Torah, actually have their correspondence, their sort of equivalence in the idea of Torah as it is learned over the generations. In other words, when you or I or anybody, wherever we are in the world, in Bournemouth, in New York, even Elstree, First Hill, right? Whenever you do that, you are in some way connecting, even Edgeware, Naftali, you are in some way connecting to that same moment of revelation. Okay? Might sound rather cryptic, right? There are various, this isn't the time for it right now, there are various halachot that actually of how Talmud Torah is learned, which have their sources in ideas to do with Har Sinai. That is part 2. Part 3. People see it?
No.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. Part 3, Gimel, if you see. He's now going to quote a beautiful midrash about the giving of the Torah. Harekach amru chachamim. This is what the sages said. Beseder hashma'at hadibrot liYisrael, as the commandments, the 10 commandments were given to Israel. Okay, when God gave the 10 commandments at Sinai, this is a midrash, a rabbinic teaching of it. Kol dibur v'dibur sheyatza mipi HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Every one of the statements of the commandments which God gave, which emerged from God's mouth literally, as they were given, nitmaleh kol ha'olam kulo b'samim. The whole world was filled with its fragrance. Each of the dibrot, it's a beautifully poetic idea, think it through. Each of the dibrot, each of the commandments that were given, they weren't just said, they perfumed the world with their fragrance. The world was filled with them. Hashem said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God. The world was filled with the fragrance of that command. Hashem said, there is Shabbat. The world was filled with the fragrance of that command. Very beautiful, poetic idea. And the Gemara asks what seems to be such like a nudnik question, seems to take all of the beauty out of the poetry of this, like a mathematical, technical question, right? You can't ask questions about poetry. This is what it says. The Parek Halzeh, says the Gemara, since the world is filled with the fragrance of the first of the commandments, how was there any space left for the second one? Isn't that great? That's so lovely, right? The world is filled with the fragrance of the first commandment. So if so, then there's not any space left for the second commandment, right? The refrigerator's full. There's not, the shopping that you've just bought back can't go in. I come on, that's not what it means, right? Is what you sort of want to say. But that's what the Gemara says, and the Gemara takes the question seriously, and in fact, it extends the idea with a lovely image. It says for Parik, it says yes, quite right. God had to take a wind out of his treasure house. God keeps the winds in a treasure house. And would blow away the fragrance of the first commandment in order to make space for the second commandment. That's the midrashic idea. Okay? Lovely piece. Now look at what Rav Hutner says. The Nimtza. This is 5 lines down in this Gimel paragraph towards the end. The Nimtza lefi zeh, we find according to this, ki lekushta de milta, the truth of the matter. Listen to the following. This is beautiful. Bishat shlitato shel dibur echad. At a time when one dibur, one statement, one of the commandments was literally ruling in the world, lo haya makom panui li'inyano shel dibur echad zulato. There was no space in the world for any of the other of the dibrot, for any of the other commandments. When Anochi Hashem Elokecha, when Hashem said, I am the Lord your God, the world was taken up with that. I mean, think of this. An idea is so powerful, an idea is so significant, there cannot be any space left in the world for anything else to be said. At that point, there is no nuance, there is no diversity, there is only the overpowering sensation of what that is. And a special action was required to remove this power, to remove this control of the first commandment, or the former commandment, in order to make space for the second one, for its friend. Ma'avir rishon rishon. To move the former ones to make space for the others. Any thoughts on this?
Immediately, there are like 2 things that strike me about this. Actually, maybe 3 things. I don't know if other people have picked up on similar things. Firstly, the theme of like synesthesia, which I think is like really interesting in like the text of Matan Torah in the parsha. The idea of hearing lightning and seeing thunder and stuff. It's a very similar concept here being employed, of being able to smell a commandment. That's like a really fascinating
that should
parallel.
be the title of the class, right? The smell of the commandments. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know. I wonder if like intentionally using a similar kind of thematic imagery, and then also I was just struck by the phrase Ma'avir Rishon Rishon. Like, to me immediately, like I just think of Slicha. I don't know if that's like he's doing that intentionally. If there's a specific connection there between command and also sin, and that he's specifically linking those 2 themes. But also about removal, like it strikes me as very similar as like the kind of Kabbalistic idea of Tzimtzum, and that there's a principle that God has to attract part of like his own holiness to make space for new things, and that they can't, multiple like infinities can't exist concurrently and things like that.
Beautiful. Aaron, I think that's definitely connected. Definitely connected to that.
Also, this relates to the previous text that you shared, in that the idea that you can only be really dealing with one thing at a time, because a particular idea can be so expansive or could have ramifications so broadly that you can only really consider one at a time. So I guess it's sort of similar in that respect. By the way, with regard to sort of the experiential side of Shavuot, it's always been interesting to me that we talk a lot about the halacha and the mitzvot on Shavuot, but we also almost forget about Matan Torah. And more broadly, revelation / religious experience is something not really talked about in the community. And obviously is something that, organized religion in general is heavily criticized for. And it's just interesting that we almost feel a lot more comfortable with, very halachic, mitzvah-oriented discussions rather than discussions of experience and senses. But yeah, I think the main, I think I can see the parallel here between this text and the one you were sharing earlier.
Right. Sometimes halacha can be a good way to not talk about God.
What I was thinking of before, less with this text than the previous paragraph. I mean, I guess both. But like what Naftali was saying about experience and the way that we are meant to experience Shabbat, and like the way that you're not meant to talk about anything happening after Shabbat. You're not meant to think about it, but that's harder to control. But definitely you're not allowed to talk about what you're doing Motzei Shabbat, and the fact that you're meant to be so totally given over to that experience, and it's meant to so overwhelm you that you have no space to think about it. And also I was thinking about the way that in my SEM, for example, it was always if you watch if you're going and watching Netflix after class, then you may as well not be here because you're part of you still not in Israel,
This immersion idea. Yeah.
Yeah, the idea that something has to be all encompassing, otherwise it's you're detracting from it by being conscious of the limitations, I guess. I don't know.
Let's see how old school any of you are in Boreham Wood. Anybody even remember Rabbi Tugendhaft?
Yeah, of course.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Remember him in Boreham Wood, Tanya? Rabbi Tugendhaft was the rabbi of the Federation, the first rabbi of it, and he taught at Hasmonean and would give me a lift to school every day. And I was this modern Orthodox BA kid, and he was a real Haredi firebrand, and he told me that learning Torah is like a mikveh, that if you go to the mikveh and you leave your little finger out, you haven't done anything at all, right? It's complete immersion or it's nothing, right? I guess in a sense it sounds like that's completely what we're teaching here. In some ways I very much disagree with that. I don't think we should think of Judaism in all or nothing terms. So I guess, Danny, I prefer your Shabbat example for it. I mean, I don't know about all of you, but Shabbat has taken on much greater importance for me in the last few months. I mean, it was always pretty important, but it's the only day now which is distinct from other days of the week. Monday is exactly like Tuesday, it's exactly like Wednesday, it's exactly like Thursday at the moment, sadly, except I do word wheel on a Wednesday with my mother, who is on the call here. If anyone wants to do word wheel, she's an expert. But I think one element of why Shabbat has become like that for me is that it's this. I mean, it sounds like it's about Shabbat the whole time, but it's become all the more apparent. It feels it's one of the only moments where I haven't got this massive raging competition for attention, and everything is only on a very surface level. Yeah. So Naftali was completely right that there is a clear connection between this paragraph and the first paragraph. And it's exactly where Rav Hutner is going to take us now with the fourth and final paragraph. Something that Rav Hutner was very interested in general, it's a theme in his religious thought, is the parallels between God and people. The more normal, the one you might have heard, sort of way of thinking about the relationship between God and humanity is actually the great difference, right? Maybe we associate this with the Rambam. God is fundamentally other. We cannot know him. Lo machshavotai machshavotechem, my thoughts are not your thoughts, that sort of idea. Rav Hutner actually is really the opposite. Rav Hutner thinks, he's got this theory which he repeats time and time again, that any fundamental element of human behavior also exists in a divine parallel. And conversely, anything which is true of God is also true of people in some way. So he thinks that in general, but here is a really beautiful and interesting way of playing it. Look at this, and I find this to be so beautiful. V'hu hadin v'hi hamida. And exactly the same thing is true. Gam ba'olam, this is just now poetry. Gam ba'olam hanefesh, also in the soul. Shel adam hamitmaser l'divrei Torah, of a person who mitmaser is it's not just commit, it's to completely subject themselves, mesirut, to the Torah. Bashar shedibur echad midivrei Torah mishtalet benafsho. At the moment when one devar Torah, one piece of Torah, I love this word, mishtalet means to rule, is ruling in their soul, is taking command of their soul. Harei kol chalala shel hanefesh, the whole space, the whole void of the human soul, mitbasem al yado, is perfumed by it. It's just such a, I mean, if you've had the experience, you know it, right? Where one idea is so powerful, it so takes you over that like there's nothing else that you can think about. Like it's like it's on your mind. You're like living with it. Your whole nefesh, as he calls it, is perfumed. Is perfumed by it. And only by an actual action, shel nituk, of removal, of separation, of disengagement, v'havara, removal, efshar lo ledibur sheni le'ha'achez b'nefesh. Does it become possible for any other piece of Torah or information or idea to get any sort of holding in your soul? When you are so enchanted with idea, when you're so committed to it, there's just nothing else that you can do, right? People are seeing the parallel here, right? If the Midrash said that when each of the commandments was given, the whole world was perfumed by the particular commandment, in exactly the same way do we as individuals, when we engage with words of Torah in a really committed sense, so too is all of us as a mini world, perfumed and overtaken by it.
This can be, I guess, like you can look at it in sort of quite a, I guess you could say like modern Orthodox setting. I don't know if that's where you're going with it, but like in the fact of, you know, the idea of us each, not just with explicit religious study, but everything we do, including our secular studies as well, will touch that Torah that we're learning.
I think that's beautiful. I mean, I guess the way in which I would think of it is less in sort of like an ideological sense of modern Orthodox, and more in just a descriptive sense of what it means to be a modern person. What it means to be a modern person, one of the defining features of modernity is that we have so many claims on our time, and we are always being forced to react to so many stimuli around us. You know, just news cycles, the fact that we know what's going on everywhere the whole time. You know, I remember seeing somebody put it very beautifully a while ago, like you develop ways to only respond in a very surface way. You can hear the most terrible news of the most terrible story on the other side of the world, but the only way to like actually stay sane is to like only engage with it on a very surface level, and you can carry on sipping your coffee. And it's such a greater challenge to us today to be able to really sort of like carve out space, time, and the commitment to say, I'm going to take this idea so seriously. I'm not just going to read it in a cursory manner. I'm going to really like invest in it. I'm going to think about it, and I'm going to read it slowly, and I'm going to like get into every moment of it. And let's just read the last words of it. Kikai Bahai Masechta. Just as Rabbi said when he was learning one Masechet, Al tishali b'masechta acharita. When I learn Masechet, don't ask me about another one. Talmuda kanatinta. The learning of the Torah is as the giving of the Torah. just as the world is filled with each of the commandments, so too an individual is filled within its single piece. And just as the Talmud's question was, since the world is filled with the first dibur, with the first one, dibur sheni laheichan halach, how on earth can you let the second one in? So I guess, like, the blessing and the task for everybody is to think, like, when was the last time that we had that experience? We didn't just hear something interesting. We didn't just read a piece, but we actually, like, had something which we felt like just, like, held us. And please God, like, Shavuot should be an opportunity for us to do that, and for us to have that. I hope people enjoyed an introduction to Rav Hutner, who is this just really wonderful, beautiful thinker.
Yashar Koch, thank you so much to Rabbi Wolfson.
Pleasure.
If people want to hang around, Rabbi, how long do you have? Do you have a minute, 5 minutes? If people wanted to ask questions or discuss the text,
well, it depends when my children come storming through the door, which they will soon. But yeah, I've got a couple of minutes. We'd be happy to carry on talking or take a couple of questions.
So before anyone leaps into the question, just to say once again, more formally, thank you so much to Rabbi Wolfson for at quite short notice agreeing to give this talk for Dor Chadash Minyan. And we're really excited to still be participating with Bournemouth Shul and running events even during lockdown. So this has been a really
fantastic.
A fantastic evening, and a huge thank you once again. And if anybody does have any more comments or questions, then we're very grateful to the Rav for sticking around for a minute or two to further.
Listen, when I'm in Boreham Wood, I'm only Joe, right? They call me Rabbi in the rest of the world, but in Boreham Wood,
what happened famously to what was it? It was a famous Jew back in the day that went back to his hometown, and they didn't consider him a rabbi. I think, isn't it? Yeah, they wouldn't call him rabbi or whatever it was. We all be a rabbi.
But when Rabbi Joe comes back to Boreham Wood, we all have to leave, because otherwise there won't be any space for the Torah that he's bringing.
No, definitely not. So when I do come back to Boreham Wood, when please God we're able to do, would love to learn in person as well.
I think just to give one final thought that I had on this, if people are still here for another minute, I think, to me, it's really fascinating that, like, throughout rabbinic texts, you have this specific notion of, like, heroism, because I think across all literature, the idea of heroism is closely combined with obsession. That what makes a character really heroic is that they have an almost inhuman possession with an ideal or a goal, like whether it's, Captain Ahab looking for the white whale or anything like that. There's like a ridiculous fixation on something. And I think the rabbis really understood the power of this idea of obsession, and that their obsession is Torah. And I think that this piece speaks to that. Like when you are so obsessed with something that you can only think about that one thing, nothing else can enter your mind. It's a very romantic conception of it, but I think it speaks to a lot of what the rabbis felt and what they want to try and encourage readers of rabbinic text to engage with.
Beautiful.
I think a lot of these ideas that I guess Rav Hutner would encourage us to reflect upon aren't necessarily, let's say, strictly halachic ideas, let's say, because there's, obviously you can have, I don't know, like a really, you can get really excited about different chazakot, for example, but, things which are really profound tend to, well, at least for me, tend not to be those things. And it's interesting in that Rav Hutner definitely talks a lot about religious experience, but in terms of that subject matter, I think it's almost like a bit of a stunted area of Jewish literature, and I think people are almost frightened to talk about it nowadays, or perhaps to some extent lack the vocabulary or lack the sensitivity, and I think it's a big hole.
Such an interesting point, Naftali, and it's one that I've thought about a lot. Firstly, I think you're not wrong. Like, it is something to be aware of. Secondly, though, I think it depends where you're looking. I think in certain parts of the Jewish world, actually, there is some really interesting and beautiful engagement with what you're talking about, with religious experience, with thinking about God. on the one hand, Rav Hutner, like I don't know if something I've achieved today is that people who are here think that Rav Hutner is an interesting person, is worth engaging with, like, great. In a very, very different space, like, Israeli music is amazing. Like, I mean, there's a lot of rubbish Israeli music, but like, there's a lot of like really, really beautiful. Like, Israeli music is far more spiritual, articulate than
Nicki Minaj.
Sorry.
Then Nicki Minaj.
Who, Naftali? Who's that?
Samuel Isaacs. He told me that it's this musician he listens to. This guy called Nick Minaj.
Yeah, there's there's some great Israeli stuff. Ben Al-Tavori, Daniel Orenstein is very, very famous.
We actually do have an expert on Israeli popular music in the chat room with us if Daniel Orenstein wants to give some recommendations later.
I'm an expert on Israeli unpopular music.
Yeah.
That's true, actually. Whenever I go cycling with Daniel, he only sings things published more than 30 years ago. But actually, Joe, I find myself often, and I know I can speak for a small amount about Aaron as well, because we talk about these things. We're not married.
Please don't.
But I often find myself looking sort of outside our tradition, whether it's like, you know, Joseph Campbell or Jung or like what, you know, these authors for content about religious experience or the religious implications to human experience. And that it could be because I'm looking in the wrong places. And it's completely understandable that we don't talk about these things more because they're so personal, they make you very vulnerable, and they're inherently sophisticated and complex. But yeah, it's something I think about, I guess, around Shavuot time a lot. And yeah, something that's been on my mind recently.
Well, you know, you won't hear from me any argument against, you know, not looking broadly and searching broadly for inspiration to bring back home. Like, you know, if you can see my mother's bookcase behind her, like, you know, that's like what I grew up with, like, it's completely. However, just like a word of like hesitation with it, like one, I think, quite trenchant critique of modern orthodoxy is that it does this bifurcation. Where it says, like, you know, well, there's Judaism, which we're committed to, and then there's all the things that we get from outside of Judaism, which negates the possibility that maybe actually internal to Judaism is the stuff that you are looking for. It's like, why are you quoting from Augustine or Shakespeare or whatever when, I mean, Augustine's a better example than Shakespeare, but when you've got when, you know, there may well be stuff in there. So, I mean, it's an interesting challenge to think with. If you want my final cryptic clue for the evening, the Rav Hutner of modern American literature is a man called Cormac McCarthy. In my mind, I don't know if anyone's into Cormac McCarthy. You might have seen the Coen brothers made.
I've read Haderach.
Nice. The Road, which is not really representative of his oeuvre. No Country for Old Men is getting there slightly more. Some of you might have seen that. So if we're interested in pairings of people within the Jewish tradition talking about, like, you know, powerful thoughts on the world, and the, like, Cormac McCarthy is there. That might have not made any sense whatsoever to majority of you, in which case I was still Facebook living, aren't we? That's funny.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Wolfson, Joe, for giving the shit. Absolutely fantastic, and thank you all for joining us for our first virtual DCM event so far. Hopefully the first of, well, I don't know, yeah, hopefully the first of more, but you know, the sooner we become less virtual, the better, I guess.
Thank you to the organisers. Thank you so much to the organisers. This has been wonderful. And Mazal Tov to Samuel's family member on his bar mitzvah in the background.
Isaac there.
Lovely learning with everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. Take care.
Thank you.
Chag Sameach, everyone.
Chag Sameach, everybody.
Everyone Shul, obviously, for all their support and everything throughout the whole thing. Thank you.
So, Rabbi Finn, I don't know how we're ending the call here.
Rabbi Finn, Yaakov.
No, it's Rabbi Finn now.
It depends on Joe. It depends on how old they are.
I don't know if we're all meant to be leaving the Zoom one by one, or if there is kind of a kill switch that the host has to plug.
I have the kill switch, but I can keep the kill switch non-killed for a bit longer if you guys want.
Right. I think I think we are wrapping up.
I'm heading out to bath time. Bye everybody.
Goodbye everyone.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Hold on, are we going to keep this Zoom open because Daniel Orenstein?
So if people want to migrate to a private Zoom chat, then we can absolutely do that. But I think we're going to wrap up the Shul live chat here. So if everybody can log off, and then if anyone wants to carry on chatting, we're happy to open up another channel. So
see ya.
Chag Sameach, and see you everyone. Goodbye.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Rabbi Finn. Thank you, Aaron.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.